Funny thing about family stories, I said to the young woman at the check-in table. The person who paid for the whole celebration is often the one no one wants to remember. She looked confused, but by then she had already handed me the small white card attached to a thin gold ribbon. I glanced down at it while the string quartet played somewhere behind the tall glass doors of the ballroom. The music floating through the warm California afternoon like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. The card wasn't heavy, just thick paper, elegant lettering, but the words printed on it made my fingers pause for a moment longer than they should have. It didn't say Eleanor Whitmore. It didn't say grandmother. It didn't even say guest. It said the absent old lady. For a second I thought perhaps it belonged to someone else. Weddings are busy things. People mix up envelopes, place cards, seating charts. I've lived 72 years, and I've learned that confusion happens. But when I looked up from the tag, the girl behind the table was already smiling politely and gesturing toward the doors as if nothing unusual had happened. You can head right in, ma'am. The ceremony will begin in about 15 minutes. I nodded slowly, the way you do when you're deciding whether something deserves your reaction or not. The ballroom doors opened into a room glowing with white roses, soft lights, and crystal centerpieces tall enough to catch the sunlight pouring through the windows. It was beautiful, exactly the way Lily said she dreamed it would be when she was a little girl sitting at my kitchen table sketching wedding dresses on the back of grocery lists. I recognized the florist arrangements immediately. Hydrangeas, garden roses, eucalyptus leaves. I remembered the invoice too. $8,400, paid 3 months ago from my account without hesitation. The string quartet shifted into another melody as guests drifted across the marble floor, glasses of champagne already in their hands. People were laughing, hugging, greeting each other like the whole world had gathered for joy. I stepped inside quietly and pinned the ribbon to my dress, exactly where a proper guest should wear a name tag. No one stopped me. No one questioned it. A few people glanced at the words and then quickly looked away, the way strangers do when they suspect they've just witnessed something awkward but don't want to be part of it. Across the room, I saw Amanda Whitmore moving gracefully through the crowd, greeting guests with that smooth, confident smile she practiced so carefully. My daughter-in-law had always understood rooms like this. Who to greet first, where to stand, what people needed to believe. When her eyes passed briefly over me, the smile didn't change at all, not even for a second. And that was when I understood something very clearly. The name tag wasn't a mistake. It was part of the story someone had decided to tell today. And judging by the way the guests were already whispering, it seemed that story had been spreading for quite a while. The first person to approach me was not family. It was a man in a navy suit who looked to be in his early 40s, holding a champagne glass and studying the room with the polite curiosity of someone who did not know most of the guests. His eyes landed on the ribbon pinned to my dress. He read the words. Then he hesitated. "I am sorry," he said carefully, lowering his voice. "Are you with the bride's side or the groom's side?" I smiled the way people do when they are deciding how much truth the moment deserves. "I am with the bride," I said. That answer seemed to confuse him even more. He nodded politely and drifted away toward the bar where a group of guests were already laughing loudly over something one of the groomsmen had said. I stood near one of the tall windows and watched the room fill with people. Lily had chosen a beautiful venue just outside Napa Valley, surrounded by rolling hills and vineyards that stretched for miles. In the late afternoon sunlight, the glass walls of the ballroom reflected the landscape like a painting. She always loved places like this. Quiet, elegant, a little grander than life. I remembered the first time she mentioned the idea, nearly 2 years ago at my dining room table, while we shared coffee on a Sunday morning. She had spread brochures across the table and pointed excitedly to pictures of white floral arches and candlelit receptions. I listened, asked questions, and then I told her something very simple. If this was the wedding she truly wanted, we would make it happen. I had saved carefully for many years. After my husband Robert passed away, I learned to treat money the same way I treated time. With patience, with planning, with purpose. Some people buy vacations or new cars when they retire. I invested my savings and watched them grow quietly. By the time Lily got engaged, helping with the wedding felt like the most natural thing in the world. I paid the venue deposit. I covered the catering contract. I even helped with the orchestra she wanted for the ceremony. None of it felt like a sacrifice. It felt like family. Across the ballroom, I could hear guests talking about the decorations, about the wine, about how perfect the evening looked. Every detail had come together exactly the way Lily dreamed. The only strange detail seemed to be the small ribbon on my dress that told a very different story about the woman standing in the room. I noticed another pair of guests whispering near the seating chart display. One of them glanced toward me before leaning closer to the other. I could almost hear the shape of the rumor without hearing the words themselves. People tend to whisper about absence in the same quiet tone they use for secrets, as if the person being discussed might suddenly appear behind them. I took a slow sip of the champagne someone had placed on the nearby table and let the cool bubbles settle. Then I looked again across the ballroom at Amanda, moving gracefully from group to group, greeting guests like the careful host of a story she had already written long before I walked through those doors. I remained near the tall window for a few minutes, watching the quiet choreography of a wedding reception before the ceremony began. Guests arrived in small groups, greeting each other with warm handshakes and easy laughter, the kind of sound that fills a room without anyone noticing how quickly it grows. Waiters moved between them carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne, their polished shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor. The string quartet shifted into a slower melody, something soft and familiar that echoed gently against the glass walls of the ballroom. From a distance, the evening looked exactly like the kind of celebration people remember for the rest of their lives. I suppose that was the point. Weddings are carefully arranged stories. Every flower, every chair, every name printed on a place card is meant to say something about family. I walked slowly toward the large seating chart displayed near the entrance. It was framed in white wood, decorated with delicate ivy and tiny gold letters that spelled out the names of every guest. People gathered around it now, tracing the columns with their fingers while searching for their assigned tables. I stood beside them and looked over the list. Table 3, Table 4, Table 5. The groom's relatives were seated close to the stage where the speeches would take place. Lily's parents were placed at the central table near the dance floor. Friends from college filled the next few rows, their names arranged neatly beside one another as if their lives had always been part of this picture. I searched quietly for my own name. Eleanor Whitmore. It was not there. I checked again, slowly moving my finger down each column. The letters were easy to read. The print was large. My eyesight is still quite good for a woman my age. But the name never appeared. For a moment, I wondered if perhaps they had simply forgotten to add it. Weddings are complicated events with hundreds of details, and mistakes happen when people are tired or distracted. Yet as I stepped back from the chart, I noticed something else that made the situation clearer. A small table had been placed near the back of the ballroom, close to the service hallway where the staff disappeared in and out carrying trays of food. 3 chairs sat there, slightly apart from the other guests. No decorations, no centerpiece, just a simple white cloth and a folded program resting in the middle. I walked toward it slowly and picked up the program to read the evening schedule. Lily and Michael's ceremony would begin at 5 o'clock. Dinner would follow at 6:30. Speeches and dancing afterward. Everything looked carefully planned and beautifully printed. But beneath the list of family acknowledgments and special thanks, there was another small absence. The names of Lily's parents were there. The groom's family was there. The wedding planner, the florist, even the orchestra received a line of appreciation. My name did not appear anywhere on the page. I placed the program back on the table and looked around the room again. Across the ballroom, Amanda was still, greeting guests with that same graceful confidence, guiding conversations, directing photographers, adjusting tiny details no one else seemed to notice. She looked perfectly comfortable in the role she had created. And in that moment, I began to understand that the little ribbon on my dress was only the first chapter of a story she had already told everyone else in this room. I remained standing beside the small table near the service hallway for a while, watching the room continue to fill with people who believed they understood the story of this family. Weddings have a way of polishing everything until it shines. The lights soften the edges. The music fills the quiet spaces. People arrive dressed in their best clothes, ready to celebrate love and new beginnings. Yet underneath all that beauty, there are always smaller truths moving quietly between the conversations. I have lived long enough to recognize them when they appear. A few minutes later, I saw Daniel enter the ballroom through the side doors near the garden terrace. My son looked older than he had the last time we spoke, though that might have been the lighting or the weight of the day itself. Weddings carry a certain pressure for parents. There are photographs, introductions, speeches, dozens of moments where everyone expects you to stand proudly beside your child and smile for the cameras. Daniel scanned the room slowly, greeting relatives as he moved forward, shaking hands, and accepting congratulations with polite gratitude. When his eyes finally reached the back corner where I was standing, he paused for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for a mother to understand. I lifted my hand slightly in greeting. He gave a small nod in return before someone else stepped into his path and pulled him into another conversation. That was the entire exchange. No embrace. No introduction to the people around him. Just a quiet acknowledgement across 30 feet of marble floor. I did not take it personally. Over the years I had learned that Daniel preferred peace to conflict, even when silence required him to accept things that were not entirely fair. Amanda joined him a moment later, sliding naturally into the center of the conversation like someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She touched his arm lightly while speaking to a group of guests, guiding the direction of their attention without appearing to do so. It was a skill she had perfected long ago, the ability to shape a room without raising her voice. I watched them for a few seconds and then turned my attention back to the program resting on the table. The printed paper felt smooth under my fingers. Lily and Michael's names were written in elegant gold lettering at the top, followed by a short paragraph about love, family, and new beginnings. The words sounded sincere. Weddings always do. But sincerity is an interesting thing. Sometimes it is genuine. Sometimes it is simply well presented. I folded the program closed and placed it back exactly where I had found it. Around me, the music continued. Guests continued laughing. Cameras flashed near the entrance as more relatives arrived from the garden path outside. The celebration was moving forward exactly as planned. The only difference was that the woman who quietly helped build the entire evening was now standing near the service hallway, wearing a ribbon that suggested she had never really been part of the story at all. And the most curious part was not the insult itself. It was the careful way the room had been arranged to make that version of the story seem perfectly reasonable. One of the waiters eventually approached the small table where I was standing and placed a fresh glass of champagne beside the folded program. He did it with the quiet professionalism of someone trained not to ask questions about the seating arrangements of guests. I thanked him and lifted the glass slowly, watching the tiny bubbles rise toward the surface. For a moment, I let myself study the room again, the way people do when they are trying to understand a puzzle that has already been assembled without them. The ballroom was nearly full now. Conversations blended together into a soft hum that rose and fell beneath the music of the quartet. Cameras flashed near the front where the floral arch had been set up for the ceremony. Lily would walk through those doors soon, smiling, radiant, surrounded by applause and admiration. I had imagined that moment many times over the past year while helping her plan the details. The dress fittings, the invitations, the long afternoons spent choosing between shades of ivory and cream for the table linens. Those were quiet memories now, tucked behind the polite distance that had slowly grown between us during the last few months. I had noticed the change at first in small ways. Fewer phone calls, shorter visits, conversations that seemed to end just a little too quickly. At the time I told myself it was simply the stress of planning a wedding. Brides have 1,000 responsibilities pulling them in different directions. Families grow busy. Life moves quickly. But as I stood there in the back corner of the ballroom wearing a ribbon that suggested I had been absent all along, the pattern began to look clearer. Stories like this rarely appear overnight. They are built piece by piece, quietly repeated until they begin to sound like truth. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. It was an older woman standing a few feet away, studying the ribbon on my dress with careful curiosity. Her expression held the gentle sympathy of someone who believed she understood the situation. "You must be Eleanor," she said kindly. I looked at her with mild surprise. "Yes," I replied. She nodded as if confirming something she had already heard earlier in the evening. "Amanda mentioned that you might come today," she continued. "She said it had been a very long time since anyone had seen you." The sentence hung in the air between us for a moment. It was not spoken with cruelty, only with the quiet certainty of someone repeating a story that had been told more than once. I took a small sip of champagne and felt the cool taste settle calmly. "Did she?" I asked gently. The woman gave a sympathetic smile. "Families can be complicated," she said before drifting back toward the crowd. I watched her disappear among the guests and felt a quiet clarity settle into place. Amanda had not simply arranged a seating chart or printed an unfortunate ribbon. She had arranged a narrative, a version of events where my absence explained everything, where the woman standing in the back corner of the ballroom had somehow chosen to stay away from the family she once built. And like most carefully constructed stories, it had been told often enough that people were beginning to believe it. I remained by the small table for a few moments longer, letting the quiet realization settle the way evening light settles across a vineyard, slowly and without argument. The music in the ballroom shifted again as the quartet began a familiar wedding melody, and a soft announcement came through the speakers asking guests to begin taking their seats for the ceremony. Chairs moved gently across the marble floor as people gathered their drinks and followed the ushers toward the rows of white folding chairs arranged near the floral arch. Conversation softened. Laughter faded into polite murmurs. The celebration was moving into its next chapter. I watched the guests find their places, couples sitting together, relatives leaning toward one another with excited smiles. The seating arrangement was very organized. Every row had been planned with intention. Close family near the front, friends and colleagues further back. I waited until most of the room had settled before walking slowly toward the rows myself. The ribbon on my dress moved lightly with each step, its thin gold thread catching the glow of the chandelier lights overhead. When I reached the first row of chairs, an usher glanced down at the tag, and then gently pointed toward the back corner, where a single row remained mostly empty. His gesture was polite, almost apologetic, as if he understood the situation but did not feel responsible for it. I nodded in quiet acknowledgement and continued walking. The chair I eventually chose sat beside the aisle near the rear of the room, far enough from the center that no one needed to step past me to reach their seat. From there I could see the entire ceremony space clearly. The arch of white roses, the long aisle covered with soft petals, the rows of guests turning their heads toward the entrance doors in anticipation. Weddings have a rhythm to them that rarely changes. The music swells. The doors open. Everyone stands. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember another wedding many years earlier when Lily was only 8 years old, standing on a chair in my kitchen pretending a dish towel was a bridal veil. She had laughed so loudly that afternoon that the neighbors heard her through the open window. She told me that when she finally married someday, she wanted the whole room filled with flowers and music. Looking around the ballroom now, I could see that she had kept that promise to herself. Everything was exactly the way she once imagined. The lights dimmed slightly, and the first bridesmaids began to appear through the doors, walking slowly down the aisle while the quartet played a gentle processional. Guests turned their heads with admiration, cameras lifting quietly to capture the moment. A few rows ahead of me, I could see Amanda seated beside Daniel, her posture perfect, her smile calm and welcoming as she greeted the guests seated nearby. Anyone watching them would believe this was a perfectly harmonious family gathering, the kind people describe later as warm and joyful. And perhaps that was the version of the story Amanda had carefully shared with everyone here. The only detail that did not quite match that picture was the woman seated quietly near the back row, wearing a ribbon that claimed she had never really been part of the family at all. The ceremony unfolded exactly the way weddings usually do, with quiet music and careful steps down the aisle, with soft smiles exchanged between families and the gentle rustle of formal clothing each time someone stood or sat again. One by one the bridesmaids walked forward, their dresses catching the warm light from the chandeliers above. Guests leaned slightly into the aisle so they could see better, phones held discreetly in their hands to capture the moment. I remained seated near the back, watching everything with the calm attention that comes naturally when you have already begun to understand a situation more clearly than the people around you. Then the music changed. The doors opened once more, and Lily appeared at the entrance beside Michael, her dress moving like soft ivory silk around her feet. The room rose together as if pulled upward by a single quiet breath. For a moment the entire ballroom seemed to pause. Cameras lifted again. Someone whispered that she looked beautiful. And she did. Lily walked slowly down the aisle with that same confident grace she had as a child when she used to parade through my living room wearing oversized shoes and pretending she was already grown. Watching her now, It was easy to remember those afternoons. The laughter. The small hands reaching for mine when she needed help tying ribbons in her hair. I wondered briefly whether she remembered those things too. The officiant began speaking once the couple reached the front of the room. His voice carried gently across the rows of chairs, talking about commitment, patience, and the quiet strength that holds families together over time. It was a pleasant speech, the kind meant to make everyone nod thoughtfully while they listened. Yet while the guests focused on the ceremony, my attention drifted to a small detail near the front row. Amanda leaned toward Daniel and whispered something that made him shift slightly in his seat. He did not turn around, but I could see the faint tension in his shoulders even from the back of the room. It lasted only a moment before he straightened again and returned his attention to the ceremony. Small gestures often reveal more truth than words ever do. The vows continued, each promise spoken clearly while the guests listened with quiet approval. Applause followed when the officiant finally announced them as husband and wife. The room filled with warmth again, with people standing and smiling as Lily and Michael walked back down the aisle together. As the couple passed my row, Lily glanced briefly toward the back of the ballroom. Our eyes met for just a second, long enough for recognition, long enough for something else too, something uncertain that flickered across her expression before she looked forward again and continued walking toward the reception doors. The music rose once more as guests began to stand and follow the newly married couple into the next room where dinner and speeches would begin. I waited until most of the crowd had moved ahead before rising from my seat. There was still time before the evening reached the moment Amanda had carefully prepared for everyone to witness. And by then I intended to make sure the story being told in this room finally included the one detail she had worked so hard to erase. The reception hall was brighter than the ceremony room, filled with the warm glow of hanging lights and the gentle sound of glasses clinking as guests found their tables. Servers moved between the round tables carrying trays of sparkling water, wine, and small appetizers while the orchestra shifted into a livelier melody. Conversations grew louder now that the formal part of the evening had passed. People laughed more freely, leaning close to one another as they shared impressions of the ceremony and admired the decorations. I walked in quietly behind the last group of guests and paused near the entrance for a moment to look across the room. The layout was beautiful. Large centerpieces of white roses stood in the middle of each table, their petals reflecting the soft light above. Place cards marked every seat carefully. At the center of the hall, a long table had been arranged for Lily and Michael, surrounded by the closest family members who were meant to celebrate beside them. I moved slowly toward the back, where my small table waited near the service hallway, just as it had earlier in the evening. The chair was exactly where I had left it. The folded program still rested neatly in the center of the cloth. A few guests at nearby tables glanced briefly at the ribbon on my dress before returning their attention to their conversations. By now the story had already settled comfortably in their minds. The absent grandmother had appeared unexpectedly. That was likely how it sounded when Amanda told it. I sat down quietly and watched the newly married couple enter the room to enthusiastic applause. Lily looked radiant under the lights as she and Michael walked toward the central table. Cameras flashed again while guests stood and raised their glasses in greeting. Amanda guided Daniel to their seats with practiced ease, greeting relatives and thanking people for coming as if she had been hosting events like this her entire life. It was impressive in its own way. She had managed to control nearly every detail of the evening. The seating chart, the introductions, even the quiet stories circulating through the guests about the grandmother who had never truly been part of the family. Dinner was served shortly afterward. Plates arrived in careful order, and the room slowly filled with the comforting sounds of silverware against porcelain. During the meal, I noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the event coordinator's station near the stage. A young man wearing a dark suit and a small headset stopped beside my table with a polite smile. He introduced himself as the reception manager and asked if everything was comfortable for me. His voice carried the gentle professionalism of someone responsible for making sure the evening ran smoothly. I thanked him for his attention and assured him that everything looked beautiful. Then I reached into my handbag and removed a slim leather folder I had brought with me earlier that afternoon. I placed it on the table and opened it slowly so he could see the documents inside. His eyes moved across the printed pages, and then lifted toward me with a look of quiet surprise. The papers were simple enough. Copies of payment confirmations, signed contracts, bank transfer records covering nearly every detail of the evening around us. The venue reservation, the catering agreement, the orchestra, even the floral arrangements rising proudly from the center of each table. I closed the folder gently and spoke in a calm voice that carried no anger at all. I simply asked him to confirm one small detail for me before the speeches began. I asked him whether the final payment for the reception had already been processed or if it was still scheduled to be completed later tonight. The reception manager studied the documents for several seconds, his eyes moving carefully across the printed confirmations and transfer receipts. The noise of the reception continued around us, laughter and conversation drifting through the room while the orchestra began playing a soft instrumental piece near the stage. Finally, he looked up again, lowering his voice slightly, as if the information itself carried weight. He explained that most of the payments for the evening had already been completed earlier in the week, but the final transfer for the venue services was still scheduled to be processed later that night, shortly before the speeches began. It was standard procedure, he said. The balance would be confirmed once the reception officially moved into the final portion of the program. I nodded slowly, as though he had simply confirmed a detail I already expected. In truth, that was exactly the case. I thanked him for his time and asked him to return in a few minutes after the dessert service had finished. He agreed politely and stepped away, clearly uncertain why a guest seated near the service hallway would be reviewing financial documents during a wedding celebration. Around the room, the evening continued with cheerful momentum. Dinner plates were cleared. Glasses were refilled. A few relatives from Michael's side of the family began telling light-hearted stories that made their table burst into laughter. Lily sat at the center table glowing under the warm lights, her hand resting gently in Michael's while guests leaned forward to congratulate them. Amanda moved easily between tables, offering warm smiles and brief conversations that made her appear like the careful architect of a flawless evening. If anyone noticed the quiet woman seated near the back of the room, they did not show it. After a while, the orchestra slowed and the event coordinator stepped onto the small stage beside the dance floor. She welcomed everyone again and announced that the evening would soon move into the final round of speeches before the dancing began. Applause followed as guests turned their chairs toward the stage. I closed the leather folder and placed it gently back inside my handbag before standing from my chair. The ribbon on my dress shifted softly as I walked across the room toward the reception manager, who was now standing beside the coordinator's station. When he saw me approach, he straightened politely, already understanding why I had returned. I spoke quietly, so only he could hear me, and told him that the final payment he mentioned earlier would not be processed tonight after all. The account used for the reception had been closed earlier that afternoon. His expression changed with sudden concern as he glanced toward the stage where the speeches were about to begin. I explained calmly that the evening had been arranged under the understanding that the woman funding the celebration was still part of the family being honored. Since that understanding had apparently changed, the financial arrangement had changed as well. I thanked him for the beautiful work his team had done and assured him that the venue would still receive fair compensation through other arrangements later if necessary. Then I turned and walked slowly toward the exit doors before the first speech began. Behind me, the orchestra paused as the coordinator stepped forward to introduce the evening's speakers. For the first time that night, however, the carefully arranged story inside the ballroom no longer belonged entirely to Amanda.